The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and disappointment. I was standing at the head of the mahogany table, laptop open, presentation slides glowing behind me on the wall-mounted screen. 15 people sat in leather chairs, their faces a mix of polite attention and barely concealed impatience. This was supposed to be my moment. The quarterly review where I'd finally get the recognition I'd been working toward for 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As you can see from slide 12, I continued, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. Our customer retention rates have improved by 37% since implementing the new feedback system I designed. The cost savings alone have generated over $200,000 in additional revenue this quarter. I clicked to the next slide, watching their faces for any sign of approval. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, nodded slightly. A few people scribbled notes. Everything was going according to plan until my uncle walked in. Uncle Rick Patterson, my mom's brother, and the company's senior vice president, strolled through the door 20 minutes late, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up like he'd just finished something far more important than my presentation. The room shifted. People straightened in their chairs. Janet's expression changed from professional interest to something I recognized as deference. "Sorry I'm late," he announced to the room, not to me. Traffic was murder on the 405. He dropped into the chair directly across from where I stood, pulled out his phone, and started scrolling through emails while I was mid-sentence, explaining the implementation timeline. I paused, waiting for him to look up. The room fell silent. Finally, he glanced at me over his reading glasses, the same condescending look he'd given me since I was 7 years old and spilled juice on his white couch. "Continue, Emma," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Don't let me interrupt your little presentation." Little presentation. The words hit me like a slap, but I swallowed my reaction and kept going. I'd learned years ago that showing emotion around Uncle Rick was like showing weakness to a predator. He'd circle back to it later, use it as evidence that I wasn't ready for bigger responsibilities. "The feedback system has also improved our response time to customer complaints by 60%, I continued, trying to regain momentum. "We're now resolving issues within 48 hours instead of the previous 5-day average." Uncle Rick murmured, still looking at his phone. "That's nice, sweetheart. Very thorough." Sweetheart. In a boardroom, in front of my colleagues, in front of Janet, who would be making decisions about my promotion next month. I felt heat rise in my cheeks but pressed on. The system is scalable, and I've already begun training other departments on implementation. Marketing has expressed interest in adapting it for their client feedback processes. "Of course they have," Uncle Rick said, finally putting his phone down. "You always were good at following directions, very reliable." The room shifted again. I could feel the energy change, the way people do when they sense conflict brewing. Janet cleared her throat softly. My colleague Marcus Chen looked down at his notebook. Sarah Williams, the marketing director, studied her fingernails like they contained the secrets of the universe. "I actually developed this system independently," I said, my voice still level but with an edge creeping in. "The feedback protocols, the tracking mechanisms, the integration with our existing CRM, all of it was my design." Uncle Rick leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Not a proud smile, not an encouraging smile, the kind of smile you give a child who's just claimed they can fly. "Of course you did, Emma. You've always been very creative with your assignments." Assignments. As if 3 years of working 60-hour weeks, redesigning half the company's customer service infrastructure, and single-handedly increasing our client satisfaction scores by 40%, were just tasks someone had given me to keep me busy. "This wasn't an assignment," I said, my composure starting to crack. "This was my initiative, my project, my results." "Right," he nodded, that same patronizing smile spreading wider. "And you executed it beautifully. Really, everyone should see what happens when Emma puts her mind to something. She's always been our best order taker." The room went dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. Order taker. In front of 15 people who would determine my future at this company. In front of Janet, who I'd hoped would finally see me as leadership material. Uncle Rick stood up, straightening his tie. Well, this has been enlightening, but I have a meeting with the board in 10 minutes. Emma, excellent work as always. Very impressive execution of the directives you were given. I wasn't given directives, I wasn't taking orders. I was solving problems, creating solutions, building systems that were saving the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. But somehow, in the span of 20 minutes, Uncle Rick had managed to reframe my entire presentation as the work of a dutiful employee following instructions, rather than an innovator driving change. He was halfway to the door when he turned back, that infuriating smile still plastered on his face. "Oh, and Emma, make sure you get me a copy of those slides. I'll want to review them before I present the quarterly results to the board next week." Present the quarterly results, my work, my innovations. But of course, Uncle Rick would be the one standing in front of the board, taking credit for the success I'd built from the ground up. "Will do," I heard myself say, hating the automatic compliance in my voice. "I'll email them to you this afternoon." "Perfect. Still taking orders like a pro, I see." He chuckled at his own joke, and I felt something inside me snap. Not break, snap, like a rubber band stretched too far, finally reaching its limit. The door closed behind him with a soft click. 15 people stared at me, some with pity, others with embarrassment, all of them now questioning whether I was the innovative leader they'd just seen present, or the order-taking subordinate Uncle Rick had painted me as. Janet cleared her throat. "Well, that was informative. Thank you, Emma. We'll be in touch about next steps." Next steps. As if there would be any, after that performance. As if anyone in that room would ever again see me as anything more than Rick Patterson's niece who was good at following directions. I closed my laptop with steady hands, gathered my papers, and walked out of that conference room with my head held high. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The rubber band hadn't just snapped. It had launched me into a completely different trajectory. Uncle Rick thought I was good at taking orders. He was about to learn just how good I was at giving them. That night, I sat in my apartment overlooking downtown Seattle, a glass of wine in my hand and my laptop open on the coffee table. The city lights twinkled below, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about tomorrow's meetings or next week's deadlines. I was thinking about Uncle Rick's face when he'd called me an order taker. I was thinking about the way the room had shifted, the way my colleagues had looked at me with pity instead of respect. But mostly, I was thinking about the email I'd just sent to 3 different headhunters, and the business plan I'd been secretly developing for the past 6 months. Uncle Rick had just made a critical error in judgment. He'd assumed that because I'd been taking orders, I was incapable of giving them. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My name is Emma Patterson, and I'm 31 years old. I live in a converted loft in Seattle's Capitol Hill district, where I can see the Space Needle from my kitchen window and hear the morning fairy horns that remind me why I moved here in the first place. On paper, I'm a senior operations analyst at Patterson & Associates. Yes, that Patterson, a mid-sized consulting firm that specializes in corporate restructuring and efficiency optimization. Off paper, I'm the woman who's been quietly revolutionizing how this company operates while everyone else takes credit for the results. I wasn't supposed to work here, not originally. 4 years ago, I was living in Chicago, working as a project manager for a tech startup that was bleeding money faster than we could raise it. I had a corner office, a team of 12, and equity options that were supposed to make me rich by 30. Instead, I had 70-hour weeks, a caffeine addiction, and a front-row seat to watching innovative ideas get buried under layers of bureaucratic incompetence. When the company folded, spectacularly I might add, with the CEO disappearing to Costa Rica and the CFO facing federal charges, I found myself unemployed with a resume that looked impressive but felt hollow. That's when my mother called with her well-meaning suggestion. "Why don't you come work for Uncle Rick? He's always said you're so smart, and the company is growing." Uncle Rick, Richard Patterson. My mother's older brother, who'd built Patterson & Associates from a 3-person operation into a 100-employee firm over the past 20 years. He was successful, respected, and according to every family gathering I'd attended since childhood, absolutely convinced that I was destined for middle management at best. Emma's very bright, he'd tell relatives while I sat right there, but she's not really leadership material, too emotional, too collaborative. In this business, you need someone who can make the tough decisions. I should have listened to that warning. Should have recognized it for what it was. A preview of exactly how he'd see me once I became his employee. But I was 27, broke, and tired of sending resumes into the void. Seattle seemed like a fresh start, and working for family felt like a safety net. The safety net turned out to be more like a spider's web. I started as a junior analyst, which was already a step down from my previous role, but I told myself it was temporary. Just until I got my bearings, learned the industry, proved my worth. The company specialized in helping struggling businesses optimize their operations, identifying inefficiencies, streamlining processes, reducing costs while maintaining quality. It was exactly the kind of problem-solving work I'd always excelled at. Within 6 months, I was handling client cases that should have required years of experience. Within a year, I was developing methodologies that other consultants in the firm were quietly adopting. Within 2 years, I'd created systems that increased our project completion rate by 40% and our client satisfaction scores by 35%. But I was still a junior analyst. These things take time, Uncle Rick would say whenever I brought up advancement opportunities. You're doing great work, Emma, but you need to understand the business side better. Maybe take some courses. Learn to think more strategically. I was thinking strategically. I was thinking so strategically that I'd identified 17 different ways the company could expand its service offerings, 12 opportunities for operational improvements, and 8 potential new market segments we weren't even considering. I'd written detailed proposals for each one, complete with financial projections and implementation timelines. Uncle Rick would flip through them during our quarterly reviews, nod appreciatively, and say, "Very thorough, I'll have to run these by the senior team." The senior team. As if I wasn't capable of presenting my own ideas to the people who made decisions about them. As if my 3 years of consistently exceeding every metric they'd set for me hadn't earned me a seat at that table. But I kept going, kept proving myself, kept believing that eventually, merit would overcome nepotism, that results would speak louder than family dynamics, that Uncle Rick would finally see me as something more than his sister's daughter who was good at following directions. The irony is that I wasn't following directions. I was creating the directions that everyone else followed. When new analysts joined the firm, they were given binders full of processes I'd developed. When clients asked for specific methodologies, they were getting frameworks I'd designed. When the company won awards for innovation and consulting practices, they were celebrating systems I'd built. But Uncle Rick's signature was on the award nominations. Uncle Rick's name was on the patent applications. Uncle Rick was the one getting invited to speak at industry conferences about revolutionary approaches to operational efficiency. I told myself it didn't matter. Told myself that recognition would come eventually. That I was building something bigger than ego. That the work itself was reward enough. I threw myself into every project with the kind of intensity that made my colleagues shake their heads and mutter about work-life balance. Work-life balance. As if I had a life outside of work. As if I hadn't spent the last 3 years of weekends in the office, perfecting systems that would make everyone else's jobs easier. As if I hadn't canceled dates, missed friends' birthday parties, and turned down invitations to networking events because I was too busy making Uncle Rick's company more profitable. My apartment reflected this reality. Sparse, functional, dominated by the home office setup I'd created in what should have been a dining room. Whiteboards covered with project timelines. Filing cabinets full of research. A desk that looked like mission control for a space launch, complete with multiple monitors and enough cables to power a small city. I had exactly 3 personal items in that space: a framed photo of my parents from their anniversary last year, a small succulent plant that somehow survived my neglect, and a coffee mug from my old Chicago startup that read, "Failure is just success that hasn't happened yet." That mug had seemed optimistic when I'd brought it to Seattle. Now it felt like a reminder of how long I'd been waiting for my success to happen. My social life had withered accordingly. I'd made a few friends when I first moved to Seattle, other transplants looking for connection in a new city. But maintaining friendships requires time and energy. and I'd been pouring both into proving myself at Patterson and Associates. The group texts grew quiet. The invitations stopped coming. The friends found other friends who actually showed up to things. I told myself this was temporary. Told myself I was building towards something bigger. But 3 years later, I was still building, still proving, still waiting for Uncle Rick to finally notice that I wasn't just executing his vision, I was creating it. The conference room presentation was supposed to be my breakthrough moment. The quarterly review where I'd finally get the recognition I'd earned, the promotion I'd been working toward, the acknowledgement that I was ready for more responsibility. I prepared for weeks, crafting slides that told the story of not just what I'd accomplished but how I'd accomplished it. The innovation, the leadership, the strategic thinking that Uncle Rick claimed I needed to develop. Instead, I got still taking orders like a pro. That night, sitting in my apartment with the business plan I'd been secretly developing, I realized I'd been approaching this all wrong. I'd been trying to prove myself within a system that was designed to keep me in my place. I'd been seeking validation from someone who would never give it, no matter how much I achieved. Uncle Rick saw me as an order taker because that's what he needed me to be. If I was capable of giving orders, of making strategic decisions, of leading rather than following, then he'd have to acknowledge that I was his equal. And Uncle Rick Patterson had built his entire identity around being the smartest person in the room. But I had something he didn't know about. Something I'd been working on during all those weekends. He assumed I was just catching up on regular work. Something that would prove, once and for all, that I wasn't just good at taking orders. I was about to become very good at giving them. The seeds of that humiliating conference room moment were planted 6 months earlier, during what should have been a routine client meeting. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was sitting in the passenger seat of Uncle Rick's BMW, reviewing my notes for our presentation to Meridian Industries, a manufacturing company that was hemorrhaging money due to outdated inventory management systems. "Remember," Uncle Rick said as we pulled into the parking lot, "let me take the lead on this one. Meridian's CEO is old school, Richard Hawthorne. He's been running that company for 30 years, and he doesn't really respond well to younger consultants. Especially not—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Women?" I supplied, not looking up from my tablet. "Well, yes, but it's more than that. He needs to feel like he's dealing with someone at his level. Someone with authority." I bit back my response. I'd been working on the Meridian analysis for 3 weeks. I knew their inventory system better than their own IT department. I'd identified cost-saving opportunities that could literally save their company from bankruptcy. But apparently my expertise was less important than Richard Hawthorne's comfort level with middle-aged men in expensive suits. The meeting started predictably. Uncle Rick led the presentation, using my slides, my analysis, my recommendations. I sat beside him, designated as his technical specialist, the person who could answer detailed questions, but wasn't trusted to deliver the big picture. It was a role I'd been forced into countless times before, but something about this particular meeting felt different. Maybe it was the way Richard Hawthorne kept referring to me as Rick's girl. Maybe it was how he'd interrupt me mid-sentence whenever I tried to explain a technical point, then ask Uncle Rick to have his analyst clarify that. Or maybe it was the moment when Hawthorne looked directly at me and said, "Sweetheart, could you grab us some coffee? I think better with caffeine." I was a senior operations analyst with a master's degree in industrial engineering and 3 years of experience turning around failing businesses. But to Richard Hawthorne, I was a coffee fetcher, and Uncle Rick said nothing. I got the coffee, I sat back down. I watched Uncle Rick present my work as if it were his own strategic vision. And when Hawthorne signed a 6-figure consulting contract at the end of the meeting, Uncle Rick didn't mention that every single innovation in that proposal had come from my research. On the drive back to the office, I finally spoke up. "That was degrading," I said quietly. Uncle Rick glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "What was?" "The coffee. The sweetheart. The way he talked to me like I was your secretary instead of the person who actually created the solution he just bought." "Emma, that's just how guys like Hawthorne operate. It's nothing personal. He's from a different generation." "And you're okay with that?" "I'm okay with getting results. We just signed a $300,000 contract because I knew how to handle the client relationship. That's what leadership looks like in this business. Leadership. As if throwing me under the bus to stroke a sexist client's ego was some kind of strategic masterstroke, as if allowing me to be disrespected was the price of doing business, and I should be grateful for the privilege of contributing my expertise while someone else took credit for it. But that meeting was just the beginning. Over the next few months, the pattern intensified. Uncle Rick started booking more client meetings without me, claiming he needed to, quote, build relationships at the executive level. When I asked to join strategic planning sessions, he'd explain that they were high-level discussions that didn't require technical input. When I proposed leading my own client accounts, he'd suggest I wasn't quite ready for that kind of responsibility. Meanwhile, my innovations kept driving the company's success. The inventory optimization system I developed for Meridian became our signature offering, generating over $1 million in new business. The customer feedback protocol I'd created was being licensed to other consulting firms. The efficiency assessment tools I'd designed were featured in industry publications as breakthrough methodologies. But Uncle Rick's name was on the bylines. Uncle Rick was getting the speaking invitations. Uncle Rick was being interviewed for podcasts about quote, revolutionary leadership and operational consulting. The final straw should have been the Henderson Industries incident. Henderson was a tech company facing a complete operational meltdown, missed deadlines, budget overruns, employee turnover rates approaching 50%. They'd hired Patterson and Associates as a last resort, with the understanding that we had 60 days to turn things around or they'd have to start laying off entire departments. Uncle Rick assigned me to the case on a Friday afternoon, with a casual, see what you can do with this mess attitude that suggested he didn't expect much. But Henderson Industries wasn't a mess. It was a puzzle. A complex, multi-layered challenge that required exactly the kind of systems thinking I'd been developing for years. I spent the weekend at Henderson's offices, interviewing employees, analyzing workflows, mapping communication breakdowns. I discovered that their problems weren't operational, they were structural. The company had grown too fast without updating their management hierarchy, creating bottlenecks where decisions were getting trapped between departments that didn't officially exist on any org chart. I designed a complete restructuring plan, new reporting lines, clear accountability frameworks, communication protocols that would eliminate the chaos that was costing them millions in delays. It was elegant, comprehensive, and exactly what they needed. Monday morning, I presented my findings to Uncle Rick in his office. He flipped through my analysis, nodding occasionally, asking a few clarifying questions. Then he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. This is good work, Emma. Really impressive. But Henderson's board meeting is Wednesday, and this kind of restructuring recommendation needs to come from senior leadership. I'll present this to them. I'd like to be there for the presentation, I said, in case they have implementation questions. That won't be necessary. I can handle any questions that come up. I should have pushed back, should have insisted on being included, should have demanded credit for my work. Instead, I watched Uncle Rick walk into that boardroom on Wednesday afternoon and emerge 2 hours later with a $250,000 contract extension and praise from Henderson's CEO for his innovative approach to organizational development. My innovative approach, my organizational development, my solution to a problem Uncle Rick couldn't have solved if he'd had 6 months instead of 60 days. That night, I started working on something different. Not another analysis for Uncle Rick to present. Not another system for him to take credit for. I started working on my own business plan. I had been thinking about it for months, really. Every time I watched Uncle Rick present my work. Every time a client complimented him on insights I'd provided. Every time I sat in the back of a conference room while he fielded questions about methodologies I'd developed. The idea had been growing, quietly but persistently, like a plant pushing through concrete. What if I didn't need Uncle Rick's approval? What if I stopped waiting for him to recognize my contributions and started making those contributions under my own name? What if, instead of being the brilliant analyst behind someone else's success, I became the success story myself? I researched the consulting market in Seattle, identified potential clients who were underserved by the big firms, but too complex for the small ones, analyzed pricing structures, competitive advantages, operational requirements, I mapped out a business model that would leverage everything I'd learned at Patterson and Associates, while offering something completely different. The more I worked on it, the clearer it became. I wasn't just planning a career change, I was planning a revolution. Not just in my own life, but in the entire industry. I was going to build a consulting firm that actually valued innovation over politics, results over relationships, expertise over ego. But I needed capital. I needed clients. I needed credibility in a market where Uncle Rick's name opened doors that mine couldn't. Most importantly, I needed the perfect moment to make my move. The quarterly review presentation was supposed to be that moment. I'd planned it carefully, a showcase of everything I'd accomplished, positioned not as an employee seeking approval, but as a consultant demonstrating value. I was going to use that presentation to establish my credentials, prove my leadership capabilities, and then leverage that credibility into launching my own firm. Instead, Uncle Rick had turned it into a humiliation, had reduced 3 years of innovation to, quote, taking orders, had dismissed my expertise as execution of his vision, had proven, in front of 15 colleagues who could have been my first clients, that he would never see me as anything more than his sister's daughter who was good at following directions. But he'd also given me something invaluable, absolute clarity about what I needed to do next. No more hoping for recognition, no more waiting for opportunities, no more taking orders. It was time to start giving them. The pattern didn't start with my career at Patterson and Associates. It started when I was 8 years old, standing in my grandmother's kitchen during Thanksgiving dinner, watching Uncle Rick explain to the entire family why I'd never amount to anything significant. "She's too soft," he was saying, gesturing with his wineglass while I pretended to be fascinated by the cranberry sauce. "Emma's a sweet kid, don't get me wrong, but she doesn't have the killer instinct you need to really succeed. She's more of a supporter. You know, the kind of person who helps other people achieve great things." My grandmother, God rest her soul, had looked at him with the kind of steel in her eyes that could cut glass. "Richard Patterson," she'd said in her crisp Boston accent, "that child has more strategic thinking in her little finger than you have in your entire head. You mark my words. She's going to surprise you someday." Uncle Rick had laughed. That same dismissive chuckle I'd heard in the conference room 23 years later. "Mom, you always were too sentimental about the grandkids." But Grandma Rose wasn't sentimental. She was a woman who'd built a small restaurant into a chain of 12 locations across New England before selling it for enough money to put all her grandchildren through college. She understood business in a way that Uncle Rick, with his MBA and his corporate climbing, never quite grasped. She understood that real success came from solving problems, not from taking credit for other people's solutions. "Emma, honey," she'd called to me, "come here and tell Uncle Rick about that lemonade stand you set up last summer." I'd approached reluctantly, sticky hands clutched behind my back. Uncle Rick was looking at me with that expression adults get when they're about to be forced to listen to a child's boring story. "Tell him about your customer loyalty program," Grandma Rose prompted. So I did. I explained how I'd noticed that the kids in our neighborhood would buy lemonade from whoever had the newest gimmick. Flavored syrups, fancy cups, colorful signs. But the novelty always wore off after a few days, and sales would drop. So I'd created a punch card system. Buy 9 cups of lemonade, get the 10th free. But more than that, I'd started keeping track of what each customer liked. Sarah from down the street preferred extra sugar. Tommy from across the park always wanted ice. Mrs. Henderson liked hers with a sprig of mint from our garden. Within 3 weeks, I'd told Uncle Rick, I had steady customers who came back every day, even when the Henderson twins opened their lemonade stand with the fancy umbrella and the glitter cups. Uncle Rick had nodded politely, the way adults do when children tell them things they don't consider important. "That's nice, sweetheart. Very organized." But Grandma Rose had seen something else. She tripled her revenue while the competition was fighting over novelty customers, she'd said pointedly. "That's not organization, Richard. That's strategy." The pattern continued through high school. I was the one who reorganized our school's fundraising approach, turning their annual car wash from a one-day event into a monthly subscription service that raised 4 times more money for the debate team. Uncle Rick attended my graduation, where the principal mentioned my innovative approach to community engagement, and his response was, Emma always was good at organizing things. In college, I double majored in business and industrial engineering, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working part-time at a local manufacturing company. I identified inefficiencies in their production line that saved them $40,000 in the first quarter alone. When I brought home the employee recognition award they'd given me, Uncle Rick had glanced at it and said, "That's great, honey. It's good to see you learning how to follow workplace protocols." Even my post-graduation job in Chicago was filtered through his lens of diminished expectations. When I called to tell him about my promotion to project manager, his response was, "Well, that's wonderful. You always were good at keeping track of details. I'm sure you'll make an excellent assistant to whoever's running those projects." I tried to explain that I was running the projects, that I had a team reporting to me, that I was making strategic decisions about product development and market positioning. But somehow, in Uncle Rick's version of reality, I was just very good at managing other people's visions. The most infuriating part was how he'd reframe my successes to fit his narrative. When I told him about developing a new project management methodology that increased our team's efficiency by 30%, he'd nod thoughtfully and say, "See, you're excellent at implementing best practices. That's a real skill." When I mentioned that I'd actually created the best practices, that other teams were now adopting my methodology, he'd smile and say, "Of course they are. You've always been good at refining existing systems." It was like he had a built-in translator that converted everything I accomplished into evidence of my limitations. Innovation became implementation. Leadership became organization. Strategic thinking became attention to detail. The worst part was how other family members started adopting his perspective. At Christmas dinners, cousins would ask what I was working on, and before I could answer, Uncle Rick would jump in with his interpretation. "Emma's doing really well in Chicago," he'd say. "She's got a great eye for operational efficiency, really knows how to execute other people's visions." And gradually that became the family narrative. Emma the executor, Emma the organizer, Emma the reliable one who made other people's ideas work. Never Emma the innovator. Never Emma the strategist. Never Emma the leader. My parents, bless them, tried to push back sometimes. "Rick," my father would say, "Emma designed that whole system herself. She didn't implement someone else's vision. She created the vision." But Uncle Rick had a way of deflecting these corrections with a combination of condescension and selective hearing. "Of course she did, Tom. Emma's very creative when it comes to finding ways to improve existing processes. That's exactly what I'm saying." It wasn't what he was saying, but arguing the point made you look petty, like you were splitting hairs over semantics. Uncle Rick was a master at making the truth sound like an exaggeration, and making clarifications seem like ego. By the time I graduated from college, the pattern was so entrenched that I'd started to internalize it. Maybe I was just good at execution. Maybe I was more of a systems person than a visionary. Maybe Uncle Rick, with his 20 years of business experience, understood something about leadership that I didn't. That's probably why I took the job at Patterson and Associates when my Chicago startup failed. Part of me hoped that working directly for Uncle Rick would finally prove my capabilities. That proximity would force him to see what I was actually accomplishing, that he'd have to acknowledge my contributions when they were happening right in front of him. Instead, the pattern intensified. Every innovation I brought to the company was recontextualized as excellent execution of standard consulting practices. Every client problem I solved was credited to Uncle Rick's strategic oversight. Every system I developed was presented as evidence of my ability to implement his vision for operational excellence. The most maddening example happened during my second year at the company. I developed a comprehensive diagnostic tool for assessing organizational dysfunction, a framework that could identify bottlenecks, communication breakdowns, and efficiency gaps across complex corporate structures. It was genuinely innovative work, the kind of methodology that consulting firms patent and license to competitors. Uncle Rick loved it, called it brilliant, and exactly what the industry needed. He fast-tracked it through the company's intellectual property process and started incorporating it into our standard service offerings. Within 6 months, it was generating significant revenue and attracting clients from across the Pacific Northwest. But when industry publications wrote articles about Patterson and Associates' breakthrough diagnostic methodology, Uncle Rick was quoted as the developer. When consulting conferences invited speakers to present on innovative assessment frameworks, Uncle Rick got the invitations. When other firms tried to poach our talent to learn about our proprietary evaluation systems, they reached out to Uncle Rick. I brought this up during one of our quarterly reviews, trying to find a diplomatic way to ask for attribution. Uncle Rick had looked genuinely puzzled by my concern. "Emma, you're absolutely getting credit for this work," he'd said. "Everyone knows you're the technical specialist who implemented the diagnostic framework. That's exactly the kind of execution expertise that makes you so valuable to this company." Implementation, execution, technical specialist. As if I'd taken his brilliant idea and figured out how to make it work, rather than creating the entire concept from scratch. "But I developed the framework," I'd said carefully. "The theoretical foundation, the assessment categories, the scoring algorithms, all of that was my original work." "Of course it was," he'd agreed readily. "And you did an excellent job of operationalizing the strategic vision we discussed. Really top-notch implementation of the conceptual framework." There was no strategic vision we discussed. There was no conceptual framework I'd operationalized. There was just my innovation, being retroactively absorbed into Uncle Rick's narrative of visionary leadership and my reliable execution. But arguing the point would have made me look ungrateful, petty, unable to see the bigger picture. So I smiled and said thank you and went back to my desk to work on the next innovation that Uncle Rick would present as evidence of his strategic brilliance and my excellent ability to follow directions. The historical pattern was clear. Uncle Rick would never see me as anything more than his very capable subordinate. No matter what I accomplished, no matter how innovative my work, no matter how many problems I solved or systems I created, I would always be Emma the order taker in his mind. What I didn't realize until that humiliating conference room moment was that the pattern wasn't about my capabilities, it was about his limitations. Uncle Rick needed me to be an order taker because acknowledging my leadership abilities would threaten his position as the visionary, the strategist, the irreplaceable mastermind behind Patterson and Associates' success. But patterns can be broken, and I was about to shatter this one completely. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in the space between Uncle Rick's laughter and the soft click of the conference room door closing behind him. 15 people sat in uncomfortable silence, some studying their phones, others shuffling papers, all of them pretending they hadn't just witnessed a public execution disguised as family banter. I stood there for exactly 37 seconds. I know because I was watching the digital clock on the wall, its red numbers the only thing keeping me tethered to reality while my mind processed what had just happened. 37 seconds of absolute clarity washing over me like cold water. The first realization hit me with surgical precision. Uncle Rick hadn't stumbled into that dismissal, he'd orchestrated it. Walking in 20 minutes late wasn't disrespect. It was strategy. Scrolling through his phone during my presentation wasn't distraction. It was theater. The "still taking orders" comment wasn't a casual joke. It was a calculated strike designed to diminish me in front of everyone who mattered. He'd done it deliberately, systematically, with the kind of tactical awareness that comes from years of practice. The second realization followed immediately. This wasn't about my performance. It wasn't about my qualifications or my contributions or my readiness for leadership. This was about control. Uncle Rick needed me to be an order taker because my independence threatened his entire power structure. If I was capable of giving orders, of making strategic decisions, of leading rather than following, then what exactly was his irreplaceable value to the company? I'd been thinking about this all wrong for 3 years. I'd been trying to prove myself worthy of promotion within a system designed to keep me permanently subordinate. I'd been seeking validation from someone who couldn't give it without undermining his own position. I'd been playing a game where the rules guaranteed I would lose, no matter how well I played. Janet Morrison cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Well," she said with forced brightness, "that was certainly informative. Thank you for the presentation, Emma. Very thorough work." Very thorough work. Even Janet, who'd seemed genuinely impressed by my results 15 minutes earlier, was already adopting Uncle Rick's framing. Not innovative, not strategic, not leadership material. Just thorough. "We'll be in touch about next steps," she continued, gathering her papers with the efficient movements of someone eager to escape an awkward situation. Next steps. We all knew there wouldn't be any, not for me. Not after Uncle Rick had so effectively demonstrated that I was nothing more than his very competent assistant, good at implementing his vision but incapable of creating my own. But as I watched Janet pack up her notes about my innovations, my results, my solutions, something else crystallized in my mind. Uncle Rick hadn't just revealed his strategy for diminishing me, he'd revealed his weakness. He was threatened by me, genuinely, deeply threatened. And threatened people make mistakes. I closed my laptop with steady hands, stacked my presentation materials into a neat pile, and walked out of that conference room with my head held high. But inside, I was calculating. Not just the immediate damage to my career prospects, but the broader implications of what I'd just witnessed. Uncle Rick had just shown me exactly who he was. More importantly, he'd shown everyone else in that room who he was. And while they might not have recognized it in the moment, I could already see how this would play out over time. That afternoon, I sat in my office, my small, windowless office with the flickering fluorescent light and the desk that wobbled when I typed, and began making lists. Not to-do lists, or project timelines, or client analyses. Different kinds of lists. First, I listed every major innovation I'd brought to Patterson & Associates over the past 3 years. Not just the big wins like the diagnostic methodology or the Henderson Industries restructuring, but everything. The small process improvements that saved hours of work per week. The client communication protocols that reduced complaint response time by 60%. The database optimization that cut report generation time in half. The training materials that brought new hires up to speed 50% faster than the old onboarding process. Page after page of innovations, improvements, and solutions, all credited to Uncle Rick, all generating revenue and saving costs under his name, all contributing to his reputation as a visionary leader in operational consulting. Then I listed every client relationship I'd actually managed. Not the ones where Uncle Rick took meetings and I did the work, but the ones where I'd been the primary point of contact, where I'd built trust, delivered results, and earned loyalty, where my name, not Uncle Rick's, was associated with success. The list was longer than I'd expected, much longer. Over the past 3 years, I'd developed direct relationships with dozens of mid-level managers, operations directors, and department heads across our client base. People who'd seen my work firsthand. People who knew exactly who was solving their problems and creating their solutions. Finally, I listed every colleague, vendor, and industry contact who'd approached me directly for advice, recommendations, or collaboration. People who'd bypassed Uncle Rick entirely to get my expertise on their projects. People who saw me as the expert, not the assistant. That list was the longest of all. By 6 o'clock, I had 15 pages of documentation. 15 pages of evidence that I wasn't just Uncle Rick's order taker. I was the secret weapon behind Patterson & Associates' success. I was the brain behind the operation, the problem solver behind the reputation, the innovator behind the awards and recognition. But more than that, I was already running my own consulting practice. I just hadn't realized it yet. Every time I'd helped a client solve a problem that fell outside our formal contract scope, I'd been consulting independently. Every time I'd provided strategic advice to other departments within client organizations, I'd been demonstrating my value as a direct service provider. Every time I'd developed a solution that other companies wanted to license or adapt, I'd been building intellectual property that could stand alone outside Uncle Rick's empire. I wasn't trapped in his system, I was the system, he'd just been taking credit for it. That realization should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt terrifying. Because if I was already running my own practice without realizing it, then what was stopping me from actually running my own practice? What was keeping me in this windowless office, accepting diminished credit for my own innovations, allowing Uncle Rick to present my work as his strategic vision? Fear. Plain and simple. Fear of failure. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of discovering that maybe Uncle Rick was right about my limitations. Fear that without his company's reputation and resources, I'd be just another consultant struggling to find clients and credibility. But as I sat there looking at 15 pages of evidence to the contrary, I realized that my fear wasn't based on reality. It was based on Uncle Rick's narrative about my capabilities, a narrative I'd been accepting for so long that I'd forgotten to question it. The truth was right there in black and white. I had the expertise, I had the client relationships, I had the track record, I had the innovations. I had everything I needed to succeed independently, everything except the confidence to try. And Uncle Rick had just given me that too. Not intentionally, of course, but by humiliating me so publicly, so unnecessarily, so obviously, he'd forced me to confront the reality of our relationship. He'd shown me that no matter what I accomplished under his leadership, I would always be relegated to the role of order taker. He'd proven that seeking his validation was not just futile, but actively harmful to my career and my sense of self-worth. Most importantly, he'd demonstrated that his opinion of my capabilities was not objective assessment, it was strategic positioning. He needed me to be small so he could stay big. He needed me to be subordinate so he could remain superior. He needed me to take orders so he could continue giving them. But I didn't need him at all. I opened a new document on my computer and began typing. Not another analysis for Uncle Rick to present. Not another solution for him to claim credit for. I started writing my resignation letter. Not the angry, emotional resignation letter I wanted to write. Not the detailed explanation of everything he'd taken credit for over the years. Not the comprehensive list of his failures and limitations as a leader. I wrote the professional, gracious resignation letter of someone who'd found a better opportunity. Because I had found a better opportunity. I was going to create it myself. Dear Uncle Rick, I began, then deleted those words and started over. Dear Richard, I typed. Please accept this letter as my formal notice of resignation from my position as Senior Operations Analyst at Patterson & Associates. My last day of employment will be 2 weeks from today. Short, professional, unremarkable. Exactly the kind of resignation letter that wouldn't raise questions or create drama. The kind that would let me leave quietly, taking my client relationships and my innovations with me. But I didn't submit it that night. Something told me to wait. To think strategically about timing and positioning. To plan my exit as carefully as I'd planned every other project I'd undertaken. Uncle Rick thought I was good at taking orders. He was about to discover just how good I'd become at giving them. But first, I needed to finish the business plan I'd been developing in secret. I needed to secure financing. I needed to identify my first clients. I needed to build the foundation for Patterson Consulting Group, my consulting firm, operating under my name, offering my innovations to clients who would finally know exactly who was solving their problems. The next morning I walked into Patterson & Associates with my resignation letter saved in my drafts folder and a plan that would change everything. Uncle Rick had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He'd forced me to stop taking orders. The next 2 weeks were the most strategically intensive 14 days of my life. While Uncle Rick basked in the afterglow of his conference room performance, I was methodically dismantling the foundation of his success, piece by piece, client by client, innovation by innovation. But I wasn't stealing anything. I wasn't sabotaging operations or violating non-compete agreements. I was simply claiming what had always been mine, my expertise, my relationships, my reputation with the people who actually knew who solved their problems. It started with a seemingly innocent lunch on Thursday afternoon. Michelle Chen, the operations director at Cascade Electronics, had texted me the night before. Coffee tomorrow? Need your brain on a workflow issue we're having. Michelle was one of my secret weapons, a client contact who'd bypassed Uncle Rick entirely for the past 18 months, coming directly to me whenever Cascade needed operational consulting. Uncle Rick had no idea that Cascade had essentially hired me as their unofficial efficiency advisor, paying Patterson & Associates for ongoing strategic support, while working exclusively with me on implementation. We met at Café Allegro, near the University of Washington, far from downtown where Patterson & Associates colleagues might spot us. Michelle slid into the booth across from me, already pulling out her tablet. So here's the situation, she began, launching into a detailed explanation of production bottlenecks that were costing Cascade $15,000 per day in delayed shipments. I listened, asked clarifying questions, and within 20 minutes had sketched out a solution that would eliminate the bottlenecks, while actually increasing overall production capacity by 8%. It was exactly the kind of work I'd been doing for Uncle Rick's clients for 3 years, except this time, I wasn't planning to hand my analysis over for him to present. "Michelle," I said, setting down my pen, "I need to tell you something. I'm leaving Patterson & Associates." Her face fell. "Oh no, when? Are you moving firms?" "I'm starting my own firm, Independence Consulting Solutions, and I'm wondering if Cascade might be interested in becoming my first official client." The conversation that followed was one of the most validating experiences of my professional life. Michelle didn't hesitate. Didn't ask about my credentials or my track record. Didn't wonder whether I could handle complex projects without Uncle Rick's oversight. "Emma, you've solved every major operational challenge we've faced in the past 2 years," she said. "Of course we'd want to work with you directly. Honestly, we've been paying Patterson & Associates premium rates to get access to your expertise. If we can work with you directly, that's actually better for everyone." By the end of lunch, I had my first client, a 3-month contract worth $80,000, starting the day after my resignation took effect. More than that, I had validation from someone who'd seen my work firsthand, that I didn't need Uncle Rick's infrastructure to deliver world-class consulting services. Over the next week, I had similar conversations with contacts at 4 other companies. Not all of them could commit immediately. Some had existing contracts with other firms, others needed board approval for new consulting relationships. But every single one expressed interest in working with me directly once they were free to do so. By the following Thursday, I had a pipeline of potential clients worth over $500,000 in first-year revenue, more than enough to launch Independence Consulting Solutions as a viable business. But securing clients was only the first step. I needed infrastructure. Office space, legal incorporation, business insurance, accounting systems, project management software. I needed to build in 2 weeks what had taken Uncle Rick 20 years to develop. Fortunately, I'd been researching this for months. I'd identified shared office spaces that offered month-to-month leases with conference room access. I'd contacted business attorneys who specialized in consulting firm formations. I'd researched accounting software and project management platforms. I'd even designed a preliminary website and business card layouts. What I hadn't done was pull the trigger on any of it. Until now. Friday morning, I submitted incorporation paperwork for Independence Consulting Solutions, LLC. Friday afternoon, I signed a 3-month lease for a small office in the Fremont district. Nothing fancy, but professional enough for client meetings and equipped with the technology infrastructure I'd need. Friday evening, I opened business bank accounts and applied for the necessary professional insurance coverage. The speed with which everything came together was almost surreal. For 3 years, I'd been moving at Uncle Rick's pace, waiting for his approval, following his timelines. But working independently, making my own decisions, setting my own priorities, I accomplished more in 1 week than I typically get done in a month at Patterson & Associates. Meanwhile, Uncle Rick was oblivious to my preparations. He'd returned from the quarterly review with renewed confidence in his position as the strategic mastermind behind the company's success. He'd scheduled follow-up meetings with potential clients, booked speaking engagements at industry conferences, and began developing what he called the next phase of our operational excellence methodology. Our methodology, my methodology, which he was planning to expand and rebrand without any input from the person who'd actually created it. On Monday of my 2nd week, I had a moment of profound clarity about just how disconnected Uncle Rick was from the actual work being done at his company. He called me into his office to discuss, quote, strategic priorities for the next quarter. "Emma, I've been thinking about ways to leverage the diagnostic framework you've been working with," he began, as if the framework were some abstract concept I'd been assigned to study rather than something I'd developed from scratch. "I want you to start training our junior analysts on the implementation protocols," he continued. "We need to scale up our capacity for this kind of work, and you're the most qualified person to teach others how to execute the methodology effectively." He wanted me to train my replacements. To create a system where junior analysts could deliver my innovations under his leadership, eliminating the need for my direct involvement in client work. It was the logical next step in his long-term strategy of minimizing my role while maximizing his control over the intellectual property I'd created. That's an interesting idea, I said carefully. How were you thinking about structuring the training program? Well, you develop the curriculum, obviously. Create standardized procedures, assessment criteria, quality control measures. Make it so that anyone with basic consulting experience could deliver the same results you've been getting. Anyone could deliver the same results. As if my expertise were just a matter of following the right checklist. As if the strategic thinking, creative problem-solving, and deep industry knowledge I brought to every client engagement could be reduced to a training manual and a standardized procedure. When would you want to start this training program? I asked. Ideally, next month. I'd like to have the first cohort of trained analysts ready to take on client work by the end of the quarter. Next month. After my resignation took effect. Uncle Rick was literally asking me to design the system that would replace me, without realizing that I wouldn't be there to implement it. I'll start working on a curriculum outline, I told him, which was technically true. I would be working on training materials, for my own firm, teaching my own methods to analysts I'd hire myself. That conversation crystallized my final decision about timing. I'd been planning to submit my resignation letter on Friday, giving exactly 2 weeks' notice as professionally required. But Uncle Rick's eagerness to replace me with trained implementers of my own methodology made me realize that I needed to accelerate my timeline. Not out of spite. Out of strategic necessity. The longer I waited, the more of my intellectual property Uncle Rick would absorb into his company's standard operating procedures. The more junior analysts would be trained on my methods under his supervision. The more my innovations would become indistinguishable from Patterson and Associates' proprietary methodologies. I needed to leave before he could fully systematize my replacement. Wednesday morning, I walked into Uncle Rick's office and handed him my resignation letter. Not the draft I'd written in anger 2 weeks earlier, but a professional, gracious document that gave exactly 1 week's notice due to an unexpected opportunity that requires immediate action. Uncle Rick read the letter twice, his expression shifting from confusion to concern to something that looked almost like panic. "Emma, this is very sudden," he said finally. "What kind of opportunity requires this kind of timeline? Maybe we can match whatever offer you've received." "I'm starting my own consulting firm," I told him simply. "Independence Consulting Solutions. I've already secured my first clients." The color drained from his face. Not because he was sad to lose me, but because he was realizing what my departure would mean for his operation. All those client relationships I'd been managing, all those methodologies I'd developed, all that intellectual property he'd been planning to systematize and scale. Gone. In 1 week. "You can't be serious," he said. "Emma, you're not ready to run your own firm. You're excellent at implementation, but the business development side, the strategic planning, the client relationship management, that's completely different from operational consulting." There it was. Even in the face of my resignation, Uncle Rick couldn't acknowledge my actual capabilities. He still saw me as an implementer who was making a naive mistake by trying to step into a leadership role. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly, "but I'm confident in my decision." "What about non-compete agreements? What about client confidentiality? What about your responsibilities to this company?" "I've reviewed my employment contract thoroughly," I replied. "There are no non-compete restrictions for consulting services I develop independently. I've maintained strict confidentiality regarding all proprietary Patterson and Associates information. And my responsibilities to this company end next Wednesday." Uncle Rick stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to figure out if this was some kind of negotiating tactic. Some play for a promotion or a raise or better working conditions. It wasn't. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't asking Uncle Rick for anything. I was telling him what was going to happen. "I'll spend this week transitioning my active projects to other team members," I continued. "I've already prepared handoff documents for everything that needs immediate attention. Emma, let's talk about this rationally. You're making a huge mistake. The consulting industry is brutal for independent operators. You'll be competing against established firms with decades of experience and millions of dollars in resources." "You're probably right," I agreed. "It will be challenging." "Then why are you doing this?" I looked at Uncle Rick, really looked at him, for what I knew would be the last time as his employee. This man who'd spent 3 years diminishing my contributions, claiming credit for my innovations, and convincing our entire family that I was nothing more than a very competent order taker. "Because I'm tired of taking orders," I said quietly. "It's time I started giving them." And for the first time since I'd known him, Uncle Rick had absolutely nothing to say. The news of my resignation spread through Patterson and Associates like wildfire in a dry forest. By Thursday afternoon, less than 24 hours after I'd handed Uncle Rick my letter, the entire office was buzzing with speculation, concern, and barely concealed panic. It started with the junior analysts. Marcus Chen, who'd been working under my guidance for the past year, knocked on my office door around 10:30 in the morning, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something close to desperation. "Emma, please tell me the resignation rumors aren't true," he said, closing the door behind him and speaking in the kind of hushed tone people use in hospital waiting rooms. "They're not rumors," I replied, continuing to organize the project files I'd been preparing for handoff. "Friday is my last day." Marcus dropped into the chair across from my desk like someone had cut his strings. "But the Henderson Industries follow-up project, the Meridian expansion analysis, the training program Mr. Patterson wants to implement, what happens to all of that?" "Other people will handle those projects," I said calmly. "The company has plenty of talented consultants. But you designed those methodologies, you built those client relationships. You're the one who understands how everything works together." The desperation in Marcus's voice was telling. Over the past year, I'd essentially been mentoring him through complex client engagements, teaching him not just what to do, but how to think strategically about operational challenges. Without realizing it, Marcus had become dependent on my guidance for everything from project scoping to client communication. "Marcus, you're more capable than you think," I told him. "You've been handling increasingly complex work. You'll be fine." "Will I, though? Because honestly, Emma, I don't think anyone else here really understands the systems you've built. Mr. Patterson talks about methodology and strategic frameworks, but when clients ask detailed questions about implementation, everyone looks to you for answers." That was the moment I realized the full scope of Uncle Rick's problem. It wasn't just that he was losing me as an employee. He was losing the person who'd been quietly holding his entire operation together. An hour later, Sarah Williams from marketing appeared at my door, followed closely by James Rodriguez from business development. Then Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the senior partner who handled our largest corporate accounts. One by one, every senior member of Patterson and Associates found reasons to visit my office, each conversation following the same basic pattern. First, expressions of shock and disappointment, then carefully worded questions about my reasons for leaving. Finally, increasingly direct concerns about the impact my departure would have on their specific projects and client relationships. "Emma," Dr. Hoffman said during her visit, "I need to ask you directly, what's going to happen to the consolidated manufacturing account? They've specifically requested you for their upcoming efficiency audit, and it's a $250,000 contract." "They requested my expertise," I corrected gently, "which other people at this firm certainly possess." "Do they, though?" Because when I tried to discuss the technical aspects of the audit methodology with Richard yesterday, he referred me to you for the details. Uncle Rick was doing exactly what I'd expected him to do, deflecting detailed questions about my innovations back to me, because he didn't actually understand how they worked. He could present the big picture, but when clients or colleagues needed to understand implementation specifics, he was lost. "I'm sure Mr. Patterson can provide whatever technical information you need," I said diplomatically. Dr. Hoffman studied my face for a long moment. "Emma, can I speak frankly?" I nodded. "Richard is brilliant at client relations and business development. He's excellent at identifying market opportunities and positioning our services strategically. But the operational methodologies that have made this firm successful over the past 3 years, those are yours, aren't they?" It was the first time anyone at Patterson and Associates had directly acknowledged what I'd been trying to prove for years. Not Uncle Rick's innovations that I'd implemented well, but my innovations that had driven the company's recent success. "I've contributed to developing some of our current methodologies," I said carefully. "Contributed to developing?" Dr. Hoffman raised an eyebrow. "Emma, I've been in this industry for 15 years. I know the difference between contribution and creation. And I know what happens to consulting firms when they lose the people who actually solve the problems." That afternoon, the panic reached Uncle Rick's office. Through my partially open door, I could hear him on a series of increasingly frantic phone calls, first with clients, then with the company's board of directors, finally with what sounded like executive recruiters. No, the transition will be completely seamless, he was saying to someone. Emma has documented all of her processes thoroughly. We have other senior analysts who are fully capable of handling her client responsibilities. Except I hadn't documented my processes thoroughly. Not in a way that would allow someone else to replicate my work without months of training and hands-on experience. The diagnostic frameworks, the efficiency assessment protocols, the client relationship strategies, they existed primarily in my head and in my direct relationships with the people who'd been implementing them. Uncle Rick was making promises he couldn't keep to clients who were about to discover that their primary consultant was disappearing, with only 3 days' notice. Friday morning, my last day, the full scope of the chaos became apparent. I arrived at the office to find Uncle Rick in an emergency meeting with the entire senior staff, trying to figure out how to handle the client crisis that was unfolding in real time. Cascade Electronics had called Thursday evening to inform Patterson and Associates that they'd be terminating their contract early, effective immediately. Meridian Industries had postponed their expansion analysis indefinitely. Consolidated Manufacturing was demanding to speak directly with me about their upcoming audit, and when told I was no longer available, had threatened to find another consulting firm. 3 major clients, representing over $400,000 in active contracts, were reconsidering their relationships with Patterson and Associates. All because the person they'd been working with, the person who actually understood their operations and had been solving their problems, was no longer available. But the client defections were just the beginning. By 9 o'clock, I learned that Marcus Chen had submitted his resignation, effective in 2 weeks. By 10:30, 2 other junior analysts had requested meetings with Uncle Rick to discuss career development opportunities, which everyone understood to be code for convince me not to follow Emma. The brain drain was starting. Around 11, I got a text message that made me smile for the first time all week. It was from Dr. Hoffman. Any chance Independence Consulting Solutions is hiring senior partners? She wasn't the only one. Over the course of my final day, I received discreet inquiries from 5 different Patterson and Associates employees about potential opportunities at my new firm. Not just analysts and junior staff, but senior consultants who'd been watching my work for years and had finally realized that Uncle Rick's reputation was built on my innovations. The most satisfying moment came just before lunch, when Janet Morrison, the same Janet Morrison who'd been considering me for promotion before Uncle Rick's conference room performance, knocked on my door. "Emma, I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "For what?" "For not recognizing what was really happening here. For allowing Richard to frame your contributions as implementation rather than innovation. For not pushing back when he dismissed your work in that quarterly review." "Janet, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. Because I just spent 2 hours trying to explain your diagnostic methodology to a client. And I realized I don't actually understand how it works. None of us do. We've all been relying on Richard's high-level explanations, but the actual substance, the technical expertise, the strategic thinking, the problem-solving frameworks, that was all you." She paused, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I also want you to know that several board members have expressed serious concerns about Richard's handling of your departure. The way he dismissed you in that meeting, the lack of succession planning for your responsibilities, the client relationships he apparently didn't realize he was putting at risk." "What does that mean?" "It means there might be some changes in leadership structure at Patterson and Associates. And it means that if Independence Consulting Solutions ever needs strategic partners or wants to discuss acquisition opportunities, you should call me directly." After Janet left, I sat in my empty office. I'd already packed up my personal items and transferred my active files, and reflected on the whirlwind of the past week. 7 days ago, I'd been Uncle Rick's dismissed order taker, publicly humiliated in front of colleagues who might have considered me for advancement. Today, I was a business owner with a $500,000 client pipeline and job inquiries from the senior staff of my former company. But the most telling moment came at the end of the day, when Uncle Rick himself appeared at my door. Gone was the confident dismissiveness I'd grown accustomed to. Instead, he looked genuinely shaken, like someone who'd just realized but the foundation of his success was walking out the door. "Emma," he said, "I think we may have acted hastily here, both of us. I'd like to discuss a counteroffer." "What kind of counteroffer?" "Senior partner. Equity stake. Your name on the letterhead. Full credit for the methodologies you've developed. Complete autonomy over your client relationships and project management. Everything I'd been working toward for 3 years. Everything I'd hoped the quarterly review presentation would lead to. Everything Uncle Rick had systematically denied me while building his reputation on my innovations." "That's a generous offer," I said. "So you'll consider it?" I looked at Uncle Rick, really looked at him, and saw something I'd never seen before: fear. Not just of losing an employee, but of losing the person who'd been making him look good for years. The person whose expertise he'd been claiming as his own strategic vision. The person who'd been solving the problems that built his reputation as an industry leader. "No," I said quietly, "I won't." "Emma, be reasonable. You're giving up everything you've worked for here. Everything we've built together." "We didn't build this together, Uncle Rick. I built it, and you took credit for it. There's a difference." "That's not fair. I provided strategic oversight, business development, client relationship management. You provided those things for your clients, using my solutions. But my clients, the ones who've been working directly with me, who know exactly who's been solving their problems, they're coming with me." Uncle Rick's face went pale. "What do you mean, your clients?" "I mean that Monday morning, Independence Consulting Solutions officially opens for business. And we're already booked solid for the next 3 months." For the first time in our entire relationship, Uncle Rick was speechless. He stood in my doorway, watching me pick up my laptop bag and the small box of personal items I'd packed, finally understanding what I'd been trying to tell him for years. I wasn't just good at taking orders, I was excellent at giving them. And I was about to prove it. 6 months later, I was sitting in the corner office of my new headquarters, a converted warehouse space in Seattle's South Lake Union district that I'd designed specifically for the kind of collaborative, innovative consulting work I'd always envisioned. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Elliott Bay. Natural light flooded the open workspace, where my team of 12 consultants worked on projects that were reshaping how companies thought about operational efficiency. Independence Consulting Solutions had grown faster than even my most optimistic projections. We'd closed our first quarter with $800,000 in revenue, our second quarter with $1.2 million, and we were on track to hit $2 million by year-end. More importantly, we were doing work that mattered, solving complex problems for clients who valued innovation over politics, results over relationships, expertise over ego. The irony wasn't lost on me. Uncle Rick had spent 3 years telling me I wasn't ready for leadership, that I lacked the strategic vision to run my own operation, that I was better suited for implementation than innovation. Yet here I was, leading a team of industry experts who'd left established firms to work for the company I'd built from scratch. Dr. Patricia Hoffman had joined us in month 2, bringing her entire client portfolio and 15 years of industry connections. Marcus Chen had come aboard in month 3, finally freed from Uncle Rick's micromanagement to develop his own consulting expertise. Sarah Williams had left Patterson and Associates to lead our marketing and business development efforts, and she'd brought insights about client acquisition that I'd never learned while Uncle Rick was handling all the strategic relationship building. But the most satisfying addition to our team was someone Uncle Rick had never even known existed: David Kim, an operational efficiency specialist from McKinsey, who'd been following my work through industry publications and had reached out directly when he heard about Independence Consulting Solutions. "I've been tracking the methodologies you developed at Patterson and Associates for 2 years," he'd told me during his interview. "The diagnostic framework, the efficiency assessment protocols, the organizational restructuring models, that work is genuinely groundbreaking. I want to be part of whatever you're building next." David brought Fortune 500 experience and a client network that immediately elevated our credibility in markets I'd never been able to access while working under Uncle Rick's limitations. Within his first month, he'd brought in 3 major contracts worth over $400,000 combined. The contrast with Patterson and Associates couldn't have been starker. According to industry sources, and the occasional update from former colleagues who'd stayed in touch, Uncle Rick's firm was struggling. They'd lost 6 major clients in the first quarter after my departure, including Meridian Industries, which had publicly stated that their contract termination was due to changes in consulting team availability. 3 senior consultants had left to join competitors, and 2 junior analysts had been let go due to restructuring needs. Most telling was the gossip I'd heard through Dr. Hoffman, who still had friends at our old firm. Uncle Rick had been forced to take a much more hands-on role in client projects, actually doing the technical work instead of just presenting high-level strategies. And apparently he was struggling. He's been working 70-hour weeks trying to deliver on promises he made when he thought you'd be there to implement them, Dr. Hoffman had told me over coffee last month. The board has brought in an interim operations manager to help with project delivery, and there are rumors about potential leadership changes. But this story isn't really about Uncle Rick's downfall. It's about the transformation that happens when you stop accepting other people's limitations as your own reality. The morning I'd walked out of Patterson and Associates for the last time, I'd been terrified. Not of failure. I'd been living with the fear of failure for 3 years while watching Uncle Rick take credit for my successes. I'd been terrified of success. Terrified of discovering that I actually was capable of everything I'd been telling myself I could do, if only I had the chance. Because if I succeeded independently, it would prove that Uncle Rick had been wrong about my limitations. And if he'd been wrong about my limitations, then I'd wasted 3 years seeking validation from someone whose opinion was based on his need to diminish me rather than any objective assessment of my capabilities. The first month of Independence Consulting Solutions was the hardest and most liberating period of my professional life. I was working 16-hour days, handling everything from client strategy to administrative details to legal compliance. But every hour was mine. Every decision reflected my vision. Every success belonged to me, not to someone who'd convinced me I was incapable of achieving it on my own. The breakthrough moment came during our first major client presentation. Cascade Electronics had referred us to Pacific Northwest Manufacturing, a mid-sized company facing the same kind of operational crisis I'd solved dozens of times at Patterson and Associates. But this time, I wasn't sitting beside Uncle Rick while he presented my analysis. I was leading the presentation myself, answering strategic questions directly, making implementation recommendations based on my own expertise. Ms. Patterson, the CEO, had said at the end of our 2-hour meeting, "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. When can you start?" Ms. Patterson, not Rick's niece, not the technical specialist, not the person who was good at implementing other people's visions. I was Emma Patterson, CEO of Independence Consulting Solutions, and my expertise was valuable enough to command premium rates and immediate client commitment. That night I called my grandmother, the same Grandma Rose who'd recognized my strategic thinking when I was 8 years old, and Uncle Rick was dismissing me as, quote, too soft for real success. "I told you that boy would be surprised someday," she said with the satisfaction of someone who'd been proven right after 23 years. "How's he taking your success?" "I don't think he's taking it well," I admitted. "Good. Maybe now he'll learn the difference between being a leader and just being loud." 3 months later, I had an opportunity to test exactly how well Uncle Rick was adapting to our new dynamic. I was at an industry conference in Portland, the same kind of conference where Uncle Rick used to be a featured speaker presenting my methodologies as his strategic innovations. This time, I was the one on stage, delivering a keynote address about revolutionary approaches to organizational efficiency. Uncle Rick was in the audience. I saw him during my presentation, sitting in the back row, watching me explain frameworks he'd claimed credit for developing. The irony was perfect. He was literally taking notes on my innovations, probably trying to figure out how to adapt them for his struggling consulting practice. After my presentation, he approached me at the networking reception. "Emma," he said, extending his hand like we were professional colleagues rather than family members with a complicated history. "Excellent presentation. Very comprehensive." "Thank you," I replied, shaking his hand with the same professional courtesy I'd show any industry acquaintance. "I have to ask, where did you develop some of those organizational assessment protocols? They seem very sophisticated for a new firm." "Where did I develop them? They were my protocols. My innovations. My solutions to problems he'd never understood well enough to solve independently." But Uncle Rick was asking the question, as if he genuinely didn't recognize work he'd been presenting as his own for years. Most of those methodologies evolved from projects I worked on early in my career, I said diplomatically. You know how it is. You build on experience, refine your approaches over time. Right, of course. Well, if you ever want to discuss potential collaboration opportunities, Independence Consulting Solutions seems like the kind of firm that could benefit from partnership with more established players in the market. Partnership with Uncle Rick. The man who'd publicly dismissed me as an order taker was now suggesting that his struggling firm could somehow benefit my rapidly growing company. I'll keep that in mind, I said politely, then excused myself to speak with potential clients who were actually interested in what I had to offer rather than what they could take from me. That interaction crystallized everything I'd learned over the past 6 months. Uncle Rick still couldn't see me clearly. Even faced with evidence of my success, even watching me present innovations he'd claimed as his own, he still framed our potential relationship in terms of what he could offer me, rather than acknowledging what I'd always offered him. But his inability to recognize my capabilities was no longer my problem. I'd stopped seeking his validation the day I handed him my resignation letter. I'd stopped measuring my worth by his opinion the moment I realized that his opinion was based on his limitations, not mine. The most important lesson I learned wasn't about consulting or business development or client relationships. It was about the difference between taking orders and giving them. For 3 years, I'd been taking orders, not just from Uncle Rick, but from a system that told me I needed his approval to succeed, his platform to showcase my work, his credibility to establish my own. But success isn't about taking orders from people who don't value your contributions. It's about having the courage to give orders, to yourself, to your team, to your industry, based on your own vision of what's possible. Today, Independence Consulting Solutions employs 18 people across 3 offices. We've been featured in Harvard Business Review for our innovative approaches to organizational development. Fortune 500 companies compete for our consulting services. Industry publications quote my research and reference my methodologies. And Uncle Rick? Last I heard, Patterson & Associates was considering merger opportunities with larger firms. Not because they were growing, but because they couldn't maintain their market position without the innovations that had actually driven their success. The final irony is that Uncle Rick was right about one thing: I am excellent at taking orders. But the orders I take now come from my own strategic vision, my own understanding of what clients need, my own commitment to building something meaningful rather than just profitable. I take orders from my ambition, not from people who mistake their insecurity for authority, and that's made all the difference. To anyone who's been the order taker in someone else's success story, your expertise belongs to you. Your innovations are yours to claim. Your vision is valid, regardless of who recognizes it. Stop taking orders from people who profit from your diminishment. Start giving orders that reflect your actual value. Because sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to accept someone else's limitations as your own reality. Uncle Rick thought I was good at taking orders. He was wrong. I was always good at giving them. I just needed to stop asking his permission to do it. 2 years after I walked out of that conference room, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible when Uncle Rick was dismissing me as an order taker. The Seattle Business Journal wanted to feature me on their annual 40 Under 40 Inches cover, highlighting young leaders who were transforming their industries. The article would focus on how Independence Consulting Solutions had become the fastest-growing operational consulting firm in the Pacific Northwest, and how my innovative methodologies were being adopted by Fortune 500 companies across the country. I was standing in my corner office, reviewing the photographer's proof sheets, when my assistant knocked on the door. "Emma, you have a visitor. He says he's your uncle?" Uncle Rick was waiting in our lobby, looking smaller somehow than I remembered. The confident swagger that had dominated every room at Patterson & Associates was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. He was studying the awards and recognition certificates that lined our reception area, industry honors that Independence Consulting Solutions had earned in just 2 years of operation. "Emma," he said when I approached, "thank you for seeing me. I know I don't have an appointment." "Of course. Would you like to talk in my office?" He nodded, following me through the open workspace where my team of 22 consultants were collaborating on projects for clients Uncle Rick could never have imagined reaching. The energy was palpable, creative, innovative, purposeful. This was what consulting could look like when it was driven by genuine expertise rather than ego and politics. Uncle Rick took the chair across from my desk, the same chair where Fortune 500 CEOs now sat to discuss multi-million-dollar consulting contracts. He looked around my office. The wall of industry certifications I'd earned independently, the shelf of business books I'd authored, the framed testimonials from clients whose operations I'd transformed. Patterson and Associates is closing, he said without preamble. I'd heard rumors through industry channels, but hearing him say it directly still felt surreal. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? He studied my face, searching for signs of satisfaction or vindication. Because you'd have every right to celebrate. You warned me this would happen, in your own way. I never warned you about anything, Rick. I just stopped enabling the illusion that your success was sustainable, without the people who were actually creating it. He winced at my use of his first name, a small but significant shift from the Uncle Rick I'd called him since childhood. We weren't family in this context. We were two business professionals discussing the consequences of strategic decisions. You're right, he said quietly, and that's why I'm here. I need to tell you something I should have said 3 years ago. I waited, curious but not hopeful. Uncle Rick had spent decades perfecting the art of reframing reality to protect his ego. I doubted he was capable of genuine accountability now. Everything you accomplished at Patterson and Associates, the diagnostic frameworks, the efficiency protocols, the client relationships, the revenue growth, that was you. Not me. I didn't provide strategic oversight or business development support. I took credit for your innovations and convinced myself I deserved it, because I was the one with the title and the experience. It was the first time Uncle Rick had ever directly acknowledged my contributions without adding qualifiers about implementation or execution. The first time he'd admitted that his strategic vision was actually my strategic work. What changed? I asked. Trying to run the company without you, he said with a bitter laugh. I spent 2 years attempting to deliver on promises I'd made, using methodologies I didn't actually understand. I hired consultants to replace you, but they couldn't replicate what you'd created because I couldn't explain how it worked. I'd been presenting your innovations for so long that I'd forgotten I didn't actually develop them. And the clients noticed. The clients noticed immediately. Within 6 months, we'd lost every major account that had been working directly with you. The new business dried up because I couldn't demonstrate expertise in methodologies that were suddenly industry standard. Methodologies you'd pioneered and other firms had adapted. Uncle Rick paused, staring out the window at Elliott Bay. The final blow came last month. Meridian Industries, remember them? Put out an RFP for a massive operational restructuring project. $2 million over 3 years. Exactly the kind of work Patterson and Associates use to win automatically. What happened? They awarded the contract to Independence Consulting Solutions. When I called Richard Hawthorne to ask why we weren't even invited to bid, he said, Rick, we need real innovation for this project, not recycled presentations of old ideas. The irony was perfect. Richard Hawthorne, the same CEO who'd asked me to fetch coffee 3 years earlier, had essentially told Uncle Rick that his firm wasn't innovative enough to compete for work that would be handled by the woman he dismissed as a coffee fetcher. There's something else, Uncle Rick continued. I've been offered a position, senior consultant at Bradley and Associates in Portland. It's a good opportunity, stable income, established client base, no management responsibilities. Congratulations! That sounds like a solid opportunity. It is, but it's also exactly what you used to be. A talented consultant working under someone else's leadership, implementing strategies developed by people who get the recognition. Uncle Rick looked directly at me for the first time since entering my office. I'm going to be you, Emma, the person who does excellent work while someone else takes credit for the vision and innovation. And I deserve it. There was no self-pity in his voice, just acknowledgement of a kind of poetic justice that neither of us could have imagined 3 years earlier. I also want you to know that I've recommended Independence Consulting Solutions to every client and industry contact who's asked for referrals over the past year. It seemed like the least I could do. That explained some of our unexpected client acquisitions. Fortune 500 companies that had reached out to us directly, mentioning they'd heard about our work through industry connections. Uncle Rick had been quietly directing business to the firm I'd built to compete with him. Why? I asked. Because you're the best operational consultant I've ever worked with. Because your methodologies are genuinely revolutionary. Because clients deserve to work with the person who actually solves their problems, rather than the person who takes credit for the solutions. Uncle Rick stood up, straightening his tie in a gesture I recognized from 1,000 client meetings where he'd presented my work as his own strategic brilliance. I have one more thing to ask you, he said, and I understand if you say no. What is it? Would you consider hiring some of the Patterson and Associates staff? Marcus Chen, Janet Morrison, even some of the junior analysts. They're good people who got caught up in my mistakes. They don't deserve to suffer because I was too proud to acknowledge who was really driving our success. It was a request I hadn't expected. Uncle Rick asking me to rescue the careers of people who'd worked for him, essentially admitting that I was now in a position to provide opportunities he could no longer offer. I'll consider it, I said, but only if they're genuinely interested in working here. Not just looking for temporary positions while they search for something better. They're interested. Most of them have been following your work since you left. Some of them have told me they wish they'd had the courage to leave with you. After Uncle Rick left, I sat in my office thinking about the conversation. Not about vindication or satisfaction. Those feelings had faded months ago when it became clear that Independence Consulting Solutions was succeeding on its own merits rather than as revenge against my former employer. I was thinking about legacy, about the difference between building something and just taking credit for what other people build. That evening, I had dinner with my parents, the first family gathering where Uncle Rick's business struggles weren't the elephant in the room. My father, who'd spent years defending my accomplishments against Uncle Rick's dismissive interpretations, was finally seeing his brother clearly. "I owe you an apology, Emma," my father said over dessert. "I should have pushed back harder when Rick was diminishing your contributions. I should have recognized what was happening and spoken up more forcefully." "Dad, you did push back. You always tried to correct his narrative about my work. But I didn't push hard enough. I let family dynamics override professional recognition. I treated his dismissiveness as a personality quirk rather than something that was actively harmful to your career development." My mother nodded. "We both did. And I think we did it because it was easier to maintain family harmony than to confront Rick about his behavior." "But you see it clearly now," I said. "We saw it clearly 2 years ago," my mother replied. "When you left Patterson and Associates and Rick's company started falling apart, it became obvious who'd actually been responsible for their success." The conversation made me realize something important about family dynamics and professional relationships. People often enable diminishing behavior not because they agree with it, but because confronting it requires more courage and energy than they're willing to invest. My parents had known Uncle Rick was wrong about my capabilities, but calling him out would have created family conflict they preferred to avoid. Understanding this helped me process not just my relationship with Uncle Rick, but my relationships with all the colleagues who'd watched him take credit for my work without speaking up. They weren't necessarily complicit in his behavior. They were just taking the path of least resistance, which often means allowing injustice to continue rather than investing in the effort required to address it. 3 months later, Independence Consulting Solutions announced our expansion into the California market, with offices in San Francisco and Los Angeles. We'd hired 6 former Patterson and Associates employees, including Marcus Chen as our new Director of Operations, and Janet Morrison as our West Coast Regional Manager. The press release generated significant industry attention, not just because of our rapid growth, but because of the talent acquisition strategy. We weren't just hiring experienced consultants. We were building a culture that valued innovation over politics, collaboration over competition, expertise over ego. The week our California offices opened, I received a handwritten note from Uncle Rick. "Emma, saw the news about your West Coast expansion. Congratulations on building something remarkable. I hope you know that watching your success has taught me more about leadership than 20 years of running my own company. I'm proud of you, not as your uncle but as someone who recognizes genuine achievement when he sees it." Rick, It was the first communication from him that acknowledged my accomplishments without any qualifiers or diminishing language. Just recognition of what I'd built and respect for how I'd built it. I kept the note not as vindication but as a reminder of how long it can take for people to see clearly when their ego is invested in maintaining a different narrative. Today, Independence Consulting Solutions is approaching our 5th anniversary. We employ over 60 people across 4 offices. Our methodologies are taught in business schools and referenced in academic journals. I've been invited to speak at conferences on 3 continents about innovative approaches to organizational development. But the measure of success I'm most proud of isn't revenue or recognition or industry awards. It's the culture we've built, a place where expertise is valued over hierarchy, where innovation is rewarded rather than claimed by others, where people are promoted based on their contributions rather than their ability to take credit for other people's work. We have a rule at Independence Consulting Solutions. If you develop a methodology, your name goes on it. If you solve a client's problem, you present the solution. If you create value, you receive recognition. It seems like basic professional courtesy, but it's revolutionary in an industry where taking credit for other people's innovations is often considered strategic leadership. The final lesson of this story isn't about Uncle Rick or family dynamics or even consulting. It's about the choice we all face when we find ourselves in systems that diminish our contributions. We can keep seeking validation from people who profit from our diminishment, or we can build new systems that recognize our actual value. I spent 3 years trying to prove my worth to someone who needed me to be worthless. When I finally stopped seeking his approval and started trusting my own expertise, everything changed. Not just my career, but my understanding of what's possible when you refuse to accept other people's limitations as your own reality. Uncle Rick was wrong about me being good at taking orders. I was always good at giving them. I just needed to stop asking his permission to do it. And that's made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.